The gavel echoed in the hushed courtroom, and Jason Hale sat rigid, pretending not to care. A nervous laugh slipped through his lips, brittle and hollow. Then it came, a piercing cry, so small yet so heavy, cutting the silence like a blade. Heads turned, eyes widened, and Jason froze as a nurse carried a baby forward, swaddled in pale blankets. The judge cleared his throat, his voice booming as he announced that DNA results confirmed the impossible truth. Jason tried to grin, muttering under his breath, "This has to be a joke." His voice cracked, trembling with denial. Marcus Reed smirked from across the aisle, arms folded, as if victory already belonged to him. The nurse whispered Jason's name softly, but it felt like thunder in his ears. His chest tightened, his palms damp, laughter dying before it left his throat. The baby's cry rose higher, and something shattered deep inside him. For the first time, in front of strangers and cameras, Jason's eyes welled, and he could no longer stop the tears. Jason stumbled out of the courtroom into the hallway, his legs weak, his breath uneven. The walls felt closer with every step, the echo of the baby's cry clinging to his ears. Grace Miller followed quietly, her presence steady but heavy with unspoken judgment. She stopped him gently, whispering his name like a lifeline, and handing over fresh papers stamped with the state's seal. Jason muttered, "No, this isn't me," his voice cracked and desperate. The polished floor reflected his hunched figure as though mocking his denial. Reporters gathered at the far end of the hall, their cameras flashing like fireflies in a storm. Jason turned his face away, shielding his eyes, but there was no escape. Grace said, "She needs you," her tone soft but firm. Jason's hands trembled as he stared at the legal words that bound him to a life he never expected. His laugh was gone, replaced with a hollow silence that rattled louder than any noise. Back inside the chamber, Marcus leaned against the wall with arms folded, his smirk sharpened like a blade. He whispered to his attorney, his voice carrying enough for Jason to hear, "He's not fit for this." Jason flinched, the words sinking like stones. The judge's order hung in the air, temporary guardianship. Jason's breath caught, the weight pressing on his chest. The baby's cries had quieted now, but the silence was worse, filled with judgment and doubt. Jason stared at Marcus, shaking his head in disbelief, whispering, "You think this is funny?" Marcus's grin widened, his silence an answer sharper than any insult. Grace stood between them, her posture tense, as though guarding the fragile balance. The papers in Jason's hand felt heavier than iron, sealing a fate he never chose. Jason stumbled into the restroom, locking the door behind him. He leaned hard on the sink, staring at his reflection, water dripping from the faucet like mocking laughter. He splashed cold water on his face, trying to erase the redness around his eyes. "Get it together," he whispered, voice shaking, but the words carried no strength. The mirror reflected a man breaking, his laugh gone, his mask shattered. He pressed both hands against the glass, forehead lowered, tears blurring the reflection, until his own face disappeared. His chest rose and fell rapidly, breath short, panic clawing through him. No matter how hard he tried to breathe, the sound of Mia's cry echoed in his ears, louder than his own heartbeat. Jason pushed open the courthouse doors, the late afternoon sun blinding as cameras flashed instantly. Reporters surged forward, microphones thrust near his face, questions fired faster than he could comprehend. His eyes darted desperately, searching for escape, but the crowd pressed closer. "Is the baby yours? Will you take custody?" The voices blurred together into chaos. Jason lifted his hand, shielding his eyes, stammering incoherently. Grace called his name, trying to cut through the noise, but he couldn't answer. He stumbled down the steps, each step heavier, as though chains bound his ankles. A hollow laugh burst from him suddenly, raw and broken, and it startled even himself. The reporters leaned in closer, recording every flinch, every crack, every tear. Jason knew the world had already seen his mask fall, and there was no way to put it back on. The night crept in heavy and suffocating as Jason Hale sat alone in his apartment, shadows stretching across the peeling walls. He tried to steady his breath, but the silence carried every ghost of his past. Memories bled into the present, nights when his own father vanished without explanation, mornings filled with unanswered questions, and the sting of promises broken before they were spoken. He laughed bitterly, forcing the sound into the emptiness, but it cracked halfway and died. His chest tightened as he wondered if history was repeating itself, if he was doomed to fail just like the man he once hated. Jason whispered to himself, "I can't be him," though his trembling voice betrayed the fear. The memory of Maya's cry clung to him, raw and relentless, reminding him that his choices now would define more than his own scars. For the first time, the weight of parenthood felt less like an accident and more like destiny. The following morning, Grace Miller invited Jason into her office, sunlight spilling across stacks of case files. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old paper, grounding him in a strange sense of order. Jason hesitated at the sight of Mia resting in a bassinet nearby, her tiny fingers curling in sleep. His heart hammered, fear rising like a tide, but curiosity pulled him closer. He crouched down, brushing a finger near her hand, startled when her grip tightened around him with fragile strength. Grace said softly, "She knows who she needs," her voice steady but firm. Jason's throat constricted as he muttered, "She doesn't even know me," yet he couldn't pull his hand away. The stillness of the room magnified the simple connection, shaking him more than the judge's ruling ever could. In that small grip, Jason felt his defenses unravel and his buried longing for belonging resurface with painful clarity. That night, Jason sat in his apartment again, silence pressing heavy against the walls. He pulled out a notepad and tried to write jokes, lines he once used to shield himself from pain. His pen scratched across the page, but the words felt lifeless, hollow shells of humor that no longer carried weight. He rehearsed them aloud, forcing a grin, but his voice cracked halfway through the first punchline. The sound of his own failure rang louder than any applause he once imagined. He slammed the notebook shut, muttering, "What's funny about this?" His reflection in the window stared back at him, tired eyes filled with doubt. For the first time, he realized laughter had been his shield, not his strength. Mia's cry echoed in his memory again, cutting sharper than any silence, pulling apart the false armor he had built around his heart. Jason's phone buzzed late in the evening, Ava Hale's voice crackling through voicemail. Her tone was sharp, carrying both urgency and unease, each word clipped as though it concealed more than it revealed. She said, "You deserve clarity," but her silence between phrases felt heavier than her words. Jason sat frozen, listening again and again, the bitterness in her voice gnawing at him. He muttered, "What aren't you telling me?" But the phone offered no answer. His mind replayed every memory of his sister, the loyalty she once demanded, the secrets she hoarded. Doubt twisted inside him, poisoning the fragile hope he had begun to build. The baby's presence had already cracked his defenses, and now his sister's voice shattered what remained of his trust. The voicemail ended with static, leaving Jason staring at the dark screen, more shaken by silence than by any confession. The next morning, Jason sat across from Grace again, the smell of coffee strong between them. His shoulders slumped as he whispered, "I don't know how to do this." Grace leaned forward, her gaze steady but not unkind. She said, "You're terrified because you care, and that matters more than perfection." Jason's eyes brimmed as he shook his head, muttering, "What if I fail her the way I was failed?" The room fell quiet. The only sound the hum of the heater and Mia's soft coo from the corner. Grace's expression softened as she said, "Every parent is afraid, but fear means you'll try harder." Jason pressed his palms together, trembling, as the words dug deep. The weight of fatherhood pressed like chains, but for the first time, he saw them not only as a burden, but as a responsibility he might carry with strength. The courthouse buzzed again, papers shuffling, voices echoing with threats disguised as procedure. Jason Hale sat at the long table, his jaw tight as Marcus Reed's attorney pushed forward new filings, their tone sharp as knives. The words carried venom, each sentence dripping with the intent to strip Jason of rights, before he had even begun to hold them. Jason's chest ached with the weight of legal jargon that painted him as reckless, unfit, and unprepared. He clenched his fists under the table, knuckles pressing white against the wood. Marcus sat behind his lawyer, his smirk like a shadow in the corner of Jason's eye. Grace Miller placed a firm hand on Jason's shoulder, grounding him against the storm. Jason whispered to himself, "They don't know me," though doubt gnawed at him like fire. The judge's gavel loomed again, each strike threatening to cage Jason in chains heavier than truth itself. Outside the courthouse, Jason's phone buzzed endlessly, but no messages offered comfort. Friends who once laughed with him at bars or late-night shows left his texts unanswered, their silence louder than insults. He walked past a cafe where familiar faces glanced his way before turning quickly back to their conversations. "Kayin?" His stomach twisted, shame pouring into every corner of his being. On the street, a neighbor muttered, shaking their head as though he had already failed a test no one told him about. At the end of the block, Pastor Cole crossed paths with him, his gaze firm, his words sharpened by judgment. "Appearances matter," the pastor said, tone dripping with disapproval, as if Jason's struggle were a spectacle rather than a life unraveling. Jason walked away quickly, but his pace faltered, the weight of whispers pressing harder than any courtroom. Back in his apartment, Jason sat hunched at the kitchen table, legal papers spread across the surface like broken glass. He stared at the ink, every word threatening to cage him deeper into choices he did not want to face. His pen hovered over the page, ready to sign away custody, his hand trembling with the pull of escape. His voice cracked as he whispered, "If I walk away, maybe it ends here." Yet Grace's words echoed in his mind, reminding him that choices harden into futures. His chest burned with the weight of that truth, knowing that walking away would carve scars into more than his own life. He dropped the pen, the clatter echoing louder than a scream in the empty room. His reflection in the darkened window showed a man drowning, and yet behind the doubt, a flicker of resolve began to stir. Jason's first overnight with Mia came in silence broken by restless cries. The apartment felt foreign, every corner now occupied by bottles, blankets, and uncertainty. He carried Mia carefully, awkwardly, her tiny body shifting against his chest, as he whispered nonsense words just to fill the air. Each cry rattled him, piercing deeper than any insult from Marcus. He paced the living room, exhaustion creeping into his bones as dawn threatened to rise. At one point, Mia's cry quieted, her small hand pressing weakly against his shirt. Jason froze, breath caught in his chest, afraid to move, afraid to lose the moment. His eyes watered, not from fatigue, but from the fragile bond that bloomed in silence. For the first time he realized he wasn't just holding her, she was holding him, tethering him to something larger than his own despair. The next day Jason met Marcus in a parking lot, the cold wind cutting between them like blades. Marcus leaned against his sleek black car, a folded envelope in hand. "Take it," Marcus said, voice calm but edged with power. "Walk away and no one will question you again." Jason stared at the envelope, his fingers twitching, the promise of release whispering in his ear. His chest tightened, imagining freedom from judgment, freedom from fear. But Mia's face flashed in his mind, her tiny hand gripping his finger with trust he never earned. Jason's hand reached out, then froze, shaking violently. He stepped back, voice breaking as he whispered, "I won't buy my way out." Marcus smirked, his silence sharper than any insult. Jason turned, walking away, the sound of his shoes on pavement heavy with defiance and fear. Jason Hale sat at the kitchen table, his hands pressed against the cool surface as the night closed in heavy and restless. The knock on his door was faint but carried urgency, pulling him upright. When he opened it, Ava Hale stood trembling, her eyes rimmed red as though she had been crying for hours. She gripped a folder tight to her chest, her breath unsteady, her gaze darting away from his. Jason whispered, "What do you want?" Though his voice cracked with exhaustion. Ava stepped inside without waiting, her posture shaking under the invisible weight she carried. She muttered, You were never supposed to know, the words cutting sharper than any knife. Jason froze, his stomach dropping as though the floor had opened beneath him. His sister's presence carried not comfort but dread, a storm waiting to break inside the walls of his home. Jason's living room felt suffocating as Ava Hale dropped the folder on the table, papers spilling across like scattered confessions. Jason's eyes darted over them, dates and signatures blurring with dread. Ava's voice cracked as she said, "It isn't what you think." Jason snapped. "Then tell me what it is," his voice trembling with fury he could barely contain. Ava's hands shook as she gathered the papers, pressing them into order only to scatter them again. Her silence screamed louder than words, her face pale with the weight of betrayal. Jason slammed his hand against the table, rattling the glass, his chest heaving with rage. Ava flinched, whispering, "I tried to protect you." Jason's jaw clenched, his teeth grinding, but the more he read, the more he felt the world unravel beneath his feet. Jason picked up a paper, his hands trembling as he scanned the signatures. The timeline cut like a blade, each date screaming that Maya's parentage was not what he believed. Ava's lips quivered as she whispered, "I buried the truth because I thought it would save us." Jason shouted, "Save us from what? From the truth?" His voice cracked into raw despair. Ava covered her face, tears slipping through her fingers as she sobbed. "I didn't want you to carry this." Jason's eyes burned, fury and heartbreak fighting for control. Every memory of loyalty and trust shattered in that instant, leaving only jagged pieces. The air between them grew heavy, silence choking the room. Jason dropped the paper, the sound echoing like a gunshot, his body sagging under the weight of betrayal that had stolen years of truth. Jason sank onto the couch, staring at a second set of documents Ava had pulled from her folder. His eyes scanned the bold letters, the results of a test that made his stomach twist violently. The DNA revealed connections that shifted everything he thought he knew. His hands shook as he muttered, "This doesn't make sense." Ava's gaze fell to the floor, her voice breaking as she admitted, "I should have told you sooner." Jason pressed his hands against his face, his breath shallow, his chest rising too fast. The truth burned deeper than lies, revealing that Mia's bloodline was tangled in ways that shattered his assumptions. He whispered, "All this time," his voice fading into silence. The room felt too small to contain the explosion of betrayal and confusion, closing in on them both. The final words came like a dagger, when Ava lifted her head, her tear-streaked face meeting Jason's stunned gaze. Her voice trembled as she confessed, "Marcus wasn't alone in this, I helped him." Jason's body went rigid, his breath stolen, his fists curling so tightly, his nails cut his skin. He whispered, "You did this to me," his voice raw, almost broken. Ava nodded slowly, shame pulling her eyes away as she muttered, "I thought I was saving the family." Jason's chest heaved, rage and despair colliding until words failed him. The walls seemed to close in, every sound muffled by the roar of betrayal. He stumbled backward, the papers falling from his grip, scattering like ashes on the floor. For the first time, Jason realized the war he was fighting had begun inside his own home. The courtroom brimmed with tension as Jason Hale sat beside Rachel Nguyen, her sharp eyes scanning every page of notes. Marcus Reed leaned back in his chair, feigning calm, while the judge adjusted his glasses. Jason's pulse thundered in his ears, sweat prickling under his collar. Rachel whispered, "Stay steady. Let me carry this." Jason nodded faintly, his hands trembling beneath the table. The air felt thick, voices echoing as Rachel rose to speak, her words cutting clean and precise. Jason's chest tightened with each line, as if the walls themselves leaned in to witness his unraveling. Marcus smirked, but the edges of his confidence cracked under Rachel's relentless tone. Jason clenched his fists, holding on to her voice, as though it were the only anchor left. For the first time, he felt he wasn't fighting alone. Grace Miller stepped to the witness stand, her hands folded tightly, her gaze steady on the judge. Jason watched, his breath caught, as she began to recount nights of crying, bottles, and his fumbling attempts to soothe Mia. Her voice was calm yet firm, painting not perfection but devotion. Marcus shifted uneasily, tapping his fingers against the table as though searching for composure. Grace's words carried truth heavier than any evidence Marcus' lawyer had filed. Jason lowered his head, a tear escaping as the courtroom absorbed the testimony. For once, he was seen not as reckless, but as a man learning, breaking, and trying. Grace's final words rang clear. He may stumble, but he shows up, and that's what a parent does. Jason's chest ached with both gratitude and fear as the weight of her defense sank into him. A hush spread as Ava Hale was called to the stand, her hands trembling as she swore the oath. Jason's stomach twisted, his eyes fixed on his sister who avoided his gaze. The judge leaned forward, his expression stern as Rachel pressed Ava with relentless precision. Ava's voice cracked, stumbling as she tried to hold on to silence, but Rachel's questions sliced deeper. Finally, Ava broke, tears spilling as she confessed. "I hid the truth. Marcus and I kept it from him." The courtroom gasped, the sound like a collective wound tearing open. Jason's chest heaved, fury and heartbreak colliding until he whispered, "You betrayed me," though the words barely carried across the room. Ava lowered her head, shame radiating like a shadow across her face, the damage too deep to repair. Jason rose to his feet, his breath ragged as the judge allowed him to speak. His hands shook, but his voice surged raw and unfiltered. "I choose her," he said, his words breaking but louder than the silence that followed. He turned toward the bassinet where Mia stirred softly, her tiny body oblivious to the war waged around her. Jason's tears streamed freely, not hidden, not denied. He pressed a trembling hand against his chest, as though steadying a storm within. Marcus's smirk finally faltered, his face tightening with a shadow of defeat. The entire room leaned into the weight of Jason's plea, a moment unmasking him not as reckless but as a man stripped bare. His voice cracked again as he whispered, "I won't walk away." The courtroom felt suspended, breaths held, time slowed by the gravity of his choice. The judge's gavel slammed against wood, the sound echoing like thunder through the chamber. The ruling was not final custody, but recognition. A place for Jason to stand, a bond given weight by law. Jason staggered back into his seat, his face buried in his hands as relief and despair collided. Marcus muttered something under his breath, his confidence fractured. Ava sat hunched, her tears silent, as though her confession had hollowed her out. Grace placed a hand over Jason's shoulder, grounding him again, her steady presence carrying him through the storm. Rachel exhaled deeply, her composure cracking for only a moment before she straightened. Jason lifted his head, eyes wet, voice a whisper, no one heard but himself. "She's mine." The sound of the gavel still lingered, a reminder of the battlefield this courtroom had become. The courthouse emptied slowly, the echo of the gavel still lingering in Jason Hale's chest. Papers rustled as he signed the conditions that tethered him to a future, both fragile and real. His hands trembled as the pen scratched across the page, binding him not just to responsibility but to Mia's life. Grace Miller stood nearby, watching quietly, her face softened with a mixture of pride and caution. Jason whispered, "It feels heavier than chains," though his voice carried no bitterness, only awe. The clerk nodded stiffly, sliding the signed forms into a file that marked the beginning of a long and costly road. Jason exhaled shakily, his chest rising with both relief and fear. For the first time, the burden was not something to run from. It was his to carry, and he chose it. Marcus Reed walked swiftly down the courthouse steps, his polished shoes striking hard against stone. Reporters swarmed him, questions flying like arrows, but he brushed them off with practiced arrogance. His jaw clenched, his eyes dark with fury, though his smile for the cameras never faltered. Jason watched from a distance, Mia's name echoing in his mind like a vow. Pastor Cole passed nearby, his gaze fixed elsewhere, avoiding Jason entirely as though he carried shame too heavy to face. The air outside was crisp, autumn leaves scattering in the wind, a reminder of seasons changing whether anyone wished them to or not. Jason pulled his jacket tighter, standing taller than he felt, as Marcus retreated to spin new stories. The silence between them said more than words ever could. This war was far from over. Later that evening, Ava Hale sat across from Jason at his kitchen table, her shoulders hunched, her eyes swollen from tears. The silence stretched heavy until she whispered, "I don't expect forgiveness." Jason's jaw clenched, his gaze fixed on the scratches in the wood rather than her face. The air between them was thick with memories of loyalty broken, of childhood ties frayed beyond repair. Ava reached across the table, her hand trembling, but Jason did not move. His chest heaved with words he could not speak, the wound too raw, the betrayal too deep. The silence became its own answer, one that hurt more than rage. Ava's lips trembled as she lowered her hand, tears spilling again. Jason whispered finally, "You left me to drown," his voice cracking. Ava bowed her head, and no reply came. The next morning, Rachel Wyan met Jason in Grace's office, stacks of paperwork between them. Her voice was crisp but steady as she outlined the road ahead. Steady work, parenting classes, and strict boundaries. Jason listened, nodding slowly, though the weight pressed heavily on his chest. Grace added softly, "You're not alone in this," her tone gentle but firm. Jason rubbed his temples, his exhaustion plain, but there was no retreat in his posture. The sound of Mia cooing in the background softened the edges of the moment, anchoring them all in the truth of why they were here. Rachel's gaze was sharp, but behind it was a flicker of compassion. Jason muttered, "I'll do whatever it takes," his voice rough yet certain. For the first time, his words carried conviction rather than fear. That night, Jason stood in the small nursery he had pieced together from scraps of furniture and borrowed blankets. The room was dim, lit only by a soft lamp, casting golden light across pale walls. Mia stirred in her crib, her tiny breath steady and rhythmic. Jason sat beside her, his body sinking into the worn chair as he hummed off key. His voice cracked, not from melody but from the weight of everything that had led him here. His eyes closed, tears slipping quietly down his cheeks. But for once they carried not only pain but fragile peace. He leaned closer, whispering softly, "I'm here. I won't leave you." Mia's breathing deepened, her small chest rising and falling with perfect calm. For the first time in months, Jason felt anchored, not by laughter or denial, but by love. The community hall buzzed with laughter and the clatter of dishes, but Jason Hale felt every eye linger on him. Whispers moved like smoke, curling into his ears, though no one spoke his name aloud. He balanced Mia in his arms, her tiny fingers clutching his shirt as if unaware of the weight pressing down on him. He straightened his shoulders, forcing himself to meet glances head-on. Some faces softened, others hardened, judgment disguised as politeness. Jason whispered, "We'll be fine," his voice breaking only for Mia to hear. For the first time, he didn't shrink away from their eyes, he carried her into the storm. Outside the hall, Marcus Reed lingered by the shadows, his tailored coat pulled tight against the cold. His voice carried low as he made one last attempt, murmuring, "You'll regret this, Jason." Before Jason could answer, Rachel Wyan stepped forward, her voice firm as steel, "The law's clear, stay away." Marcus's jaw tightened, his smirk breaking as the weight of defeat finally pressed against him. Jason held Mia closer, his silence louder than any threat. The night air cut sharp, but his resolve burned warmer than ever before. The porch light flickered as Jason returned home, only to find an envelope resting on the step. He bent down carefully, Mia tucked against him, and opened it with shaking fingers. Ava Hale's handwriting sprawled across the page, an apology dripping with regret. Her words begged for understanding, but Jason's heart ached too deeply for trust. He whispered, "It's too late," though his eyes burned with sorrow. Folding the letter, he set it aside, unsure if forgiveness would ever bloom. The porch creaked beneath his feet as he carried Mia inside, the door closing softly against the night. At the clinic the next morning, Jason held Mia on his lap while the doctor listened carefully to her heartbeat. His chest loosened for the first time in weeks when the doctor smiled gently and said, "She's strong." Jason exhaled a breath he didn't know he was holding, his shoulders sagging with fragile relief. Nia squirmed, letting out a soft coo that filled the sterile room with warmth. Jason pressed his cheek gently against her head, whispering, "We made it this far." The doctor scribbled notes quietly, giving the moment space. For Jason, strength wasn't just in survival, it was in choosing to stay. That night, Jason stood by Mia's crib, the room bathed in soft lamplight. He whispered, "They tried to make me laugh it off. But you taught me how to cry and stay." His voice cracked, tears slipping down his cheeks, but his smile held steady. He leaned closer, brushing Mia's tiny hand with his finger. She stirred slightly, her breath steady, her innocence unbroken by the battles fought for her. Jason straightened slowly, his silhouette framed by the golden light, the quiet heavy with promise. The war was not over, but for this moment, peace was his.